Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. We got 2 hours of open forum for you on this Tuesday afternoon, so perfect time to pick up the phone and call if you've got a question you've been thinking, I want to ask those guys over there at Catholic Answers this question. 888-318-7884 is the number. Open forum means open to anyone and anything. 888-318-7884. And by anything, I mean anything today, because both hours we've got Jimmy Akin with us, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, has his own Wikipedia page. I found that out today. And the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Willkommen, Herr Kellett.
What is
Guten
that?
Tag.
Why German? What on earth?
know.
It just came. This is not related to our conversation about a certain German artist last time you were on, is
It
it?
is not related to that.
And I use the word artist loosely. 888-318-7884 is the number. 888-318-7884. You know, Jimmy, since you started in German, and Guten Tag, by the way, when you're like, I would like to learn this language, where do you go? Like, is there some, like, Jimmy Akin goes, you know what, I like this system, all right?
Yeah. I mean, assuming I want more than a word or two of it, if I want to systematically study a language and it's a living language, then my first stop is going to be Pimsleur.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's a technique. It's called the Pimsleur method. It was invented by a linguist called Paul Pimsleur, and it has a couple of features that separate it. It has a few features that separate it from other language learning methods. One is it's all audio, and you practice it by imitating native speakers. So you listen to native speakers, and each Pimsleur lesson, they're like 30 minutes long, it starts with a little dialogue between a couple of native speakers.
Okay.
And you listen to that dialogue, and then they teach you how to understand it during the course of the lesson. And in the very first lesson of each set, you start with this dialogue and you have no idea what they're saying. And by the end of 30 minutes, you understand exactly what they're saying.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, they also teach you, the very first thing they teach you is a phrase that you're going to need to know in any language you're learning, which is excuse me. That's the very first thing you learn, because you're going to need to say excuse me a lot when you're trying to talk a language you're just learning. They also use what's called graduated interval recall, which means they initially have you learn stuff. They'll have you learn a given fact, and they'll repeat it frequently at the beginning, but then they start increasing the intervals between when you get quizzed on it again. So over time, as you're learning new things, you get reminders of the stuff you already know, but they're progressively more space between them. But they do keep coming back. So you do get reminders. They also, and this is one of the most unique things about the Pimsleur method, is if you're learning a multisyllable word, they teach you the end of the word first. So, for example, just to cite a simple example, I said willkommen, which means welcome to you at the beginning. And if they were teaching you willkommen in German, they would start with men, then kommen, then willkommen. And the reason they do that is this is based on actual, tests that were done by Paul Pimsleur, where he found that people tend to remember the fronts of words easier, but they have a harder time remembering the backs of words. And so by teaching you the syllables in reverse order, it drills in the thing that's going to be the hardest for you to remember. They also expect you to use, to think about what you're doing. You're not just memorizing. So, for example, they'll teach you, here's how to say this to a man. And then you learn how to say it to a man. And then later they'll teach you something unrelated about talking to a woman. And then they'll say, now try to say this thing you learned earlier for a man to a woman. And you got to think about, how do you pull these two different pieces of information together to be able to say the same thing to a woman. Or they'll teach you, here's how to say this thing happened. And then later they'll teach you a little bit about saying the future tense. And then they'll say, now try to say this thing will happen. and you got to figure out how to do that. So you're actively mentally engaged in what you're doing. You're not just repeating. And it's a very successful system. It's available for a lot of living languages. Unfortunately, they don't have a Latin or New Testament Greek. They do have a Hebrew, though, and Hebrew is similar enough to biblical Hebrew that it is actually useful. I was at a conference in Detroit once. It was like a Catholic conference, and Father Pacwa and then Archbishop Raymond Burke and I were on a panel discussion together. And just for a joke, I said, well, since I'm here in Detroit, it reminds me of the great biblical saying. And then in Hebrew, I said, I'd like to get 40 gallons of gas for my car, please. And Father Pacwa, whose mouth, because Detroit's the Motor City.
Right.
And Father Pacwa, who speaks Hebrew fluently, his mouth just fell open.
Really? Oh, that's funny. All right, so Pimsleur is your recommended. Oh, I'm glad to know it. Thanks, Jimmy.
At least are the ones I've tried.
The lines are full now, so off we go. We're starting in Canada, Newfoundland, Canada. Colin is listening on Catholic.com. Colin, we're glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi. With the concept of time travel prayer that you explore in Mysterious World episode 208, if God does allow his people to interact across time in that way, do we have a sort of time traveler's tourist paradox or future saints? For example, we have lots of instances of private revelation where we see past saints appearing to like people and telling them about they're praying for them and all that. But do we have examples of a soul identifying itself as being from the future and saying that, like, I'm praying for you because of these things you did for me, like, and before I was born, essentially, kind of a thing?
I am not aware of any phenomenon like that has been reported. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I would think it actually could happen because God's omnipotent, and so he can do anything he chooses. And God could choose to let someone from the future appear to someone in the past, whether that person's in heaven or not. In fact, I am aware of apparitions where something like that happens, where someone from the future is talking to someone in the past, and from the perspective of the person in the past, they're talking to someone in the future, but they didn't involve saints in heaven. They involved someone who was here on earth talking to someone in the past. And but if God can do that with people who are alive, he could certainly do that with people who are in heaven as well. I'm just not aware of any situation where that has been reported. It may very well have been reported because I think the great majority of paranormal experiences like this don't get reported and don't get investigated. So it may well have happened. It also, even if it hasn't happened, though, it may not have happened yet because people aren't that open to this idea. They haven't been thinking about time in this way. And we do have evidence that paranormal or supernatural experiences are correlated with what people are open to. So, for example, Cy Kellett, you may recall some stories from the Gospels where it will say Jesus couldn't do many miracles in a given town.
Right.
And why did it say he couldn't do many miracles in a given town?
Their lack of faith.
Their lack of faith, right. They were not open to Jesus doing a lot of miracles in their town, and so he didn't do very many. And in the same way, if people are closed to an experience, then they tend not to have it. And so, Colin, since you've thought of this, maybe you're open to this experience, and maybe some future saint will appear to you.
That would definitely be interesting.
Yeah, wouldn't it?
and possibly quite helpful, Colin. It tends to be when they show up. All right, well, you got us to the break, Colin. Thanks for starting us off. It's open forum, one line open. Jimmy Aiken, our guest, 888-318-7884.
Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
Proclaiming the faith, changing lives.
The year was 2005. EWTN begins celebrating 25 years with its first family celebration in Denver, Colorado. Attendees will hear renowned speakers and can visit with the network's hosts and well-known Catholic authors.
To learn more about Mother Angelica's life and the history of EWTN, visit EWTN.com/Mother Angelica.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Darren, did Carrie know that Jimmy's going to be on today? Because I got to read the ad, and I want to see. I want a heads up if Carrie put anything in there, anything goofy. We'll see. All right, here we go. Still looking for that perfect Christmas gift for your loved one? Look no further. Shop.Catholic.com's store-wide sale has just the right item for everyone on your list. Hundreds of items at 10 to 25% off and more. We've added hundreds of new items this year, almost 200 new products in total. For those of you who speak Latin, si haec occasiones praeterieris plane frustratus eris. I'd have no idea. He said, if you pass up these opportunities, you will be completely disappointed. What are you waiting for? Get on over to shop.catholic.com today and let the savings begin. I apologize to anyone who actually speaks Latin. I'm sure.
I was going to say, Cy Kellett, you've got a very, very interesting Latin accent.
It's called Southern California Latin. I learned it
with lashings of Spanish.
That's probably true, huh? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not going to go back over it. That's enough of that. Thanks, Carrie. Let's keep them in English from now on. All right, let's go to Jack in Waterford, Wisconsin, listening on WSFI. Glad you're here, Jack. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy. How are you?
Doing okay.
I'm a Christian. By the way, I love your Mysterious World. I listen to it all the time.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Lutheran. I grew up in a split house. My dad's Catholic. My mom was Lutheran. So we became Lutheran. But the question I have is, I believe in heaven. What I wrestle with is reincarnation, and when people can remember past lives, especially when you have like little kids that you see that. I saw one guy that was a little kid that he remembered that he was a pilot. I think it was in World War II when he actually... That's the
James Leininger case.
Yes. I think his sister's still alive, and she confirmed a whole bunch of things this kid said that there's no way he could possibly know. And I wonder about things like that. Like when you have deja vu moments when you're little that, how would you have had that? And things like that. So I guess that's what the question I had for you is, how do you explain that? Because I wrestle with that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, since you mentioned that you're a fan of Mysterious World, I'll recommend a couple of episodes of that where I actually look into this question. They're episodes 275 and 276. You can get to them by going to mysterious.fm/275. and also mysterious.fm/276. In episode 275, I survey how modern reincarnation research works, and as you indicate, it tends to focus on children, because what parapsychologists and reincarnation researchers have found is that adult cases aren't really that great for a couple of reasons. One of them is adults have lived, longer lives, and so they have experienced a lot more stuff, most of which they have forgotten. Most of us don't remember every movie we've ever seen or every book we've ever read, but there could still be information that we learned about historical periods in our memories somewhere, and it could come out without us realizing the source of the information, and we could then confuse that information for a past life memory. This source amnesia, or not knowing where the information comes from, is sometimes called cryptomnesia. In Greek, kryptos means hidden and mnesia means memory. So these would be hidden memories that we don't remember where they came from. Like, for example, Psychelet, what was the first time you ever heard the word apple?
Not a clue.
Yeah, see, exactly. A lot of things we know are, Psychelet knows the meaning of the word apple. At least I assume he does. I haven't tested him on that. But he, as an English speaker, he knows the word apple, but has no idea where he learned that. And this is true for a lot of the stuff we know. We remember the stuff, but we don't know where it came from. And because adults have these longer lives where we've been exposed to so much information, it's very hard to establish in a reported reincarnation case that someone didn't learn this at some point in their life and they've just forgotten it. In fact, there have been reported reincarnation cases where it later turned out, oh yeah, this person read a book about this, and they initially just forgot they read a book, but the book was the real source of the information. The other reason that adult cases are problematic is a lot of them are based on hypnosis. And despite what a lot of people would have you think, hypnosis is not a magic memory aid. It actually promotes confabulation or false memories. And when reincarnation researchers have tried to verify claims that people reported under hypnotic regression, there's a very low success rate. They're unable to verify hardly anything that people say under hypnosis. So the adult cases aren't very promising, but there are cases of children who report remembering things that happened to somebody else before the time of their birth. And the question is how to explain that. Well, that's what I deal with in episode 276 of Mysterious World, where I look at different reincarnation theories. And basically, there are 3 theories to explain what happens or why, people like children will have these memories or apparent memories. The first category is what I call soul theories. The second is what I call residue theories, and the third are what I call psychic theories. Now, these are in addition to natural theories, where you could explain the apparent memories by things like parents unintentionally coaching the child, without even realizing it, or other natural ways, like a child could have cryptomnesia. They could have learned something by watching a movie and forgot it. So once you eliminate the natural explanations for these apparent memories, if there are substantial memories that go beyond what the child could just guess by random chance that turn out to be true, you could explain those memories either in terms of soul, residue, or psychic theories. A soul theory is essentially that reincarnation is true. That there is something that you could call a soul that passes from one person to another and carries those memories with it. So when one person dies, their soul leaves their body, enters a new body, and that's how the memories get there. This is not really compatible with Christianity. The book of Hebrews says that it is appointed for man once to die, and then comes judgment. And the author of Hebrews is specifically responding here to ideas about reincarnation that were around in Greco-Roman culture at the time, because there were Greeks and Romans who believed in reincarnation. And so that's what the biblical author is rejecting. But then there are the other 2 possibilities, neither of which involves an actual soul moving from one person to another. Those 2 theories, oh, by the way, I should mention the soul theory is common in the major world religion known as Hinduism. In Hinduism, they refer to the soul as an Atman. That's just their word for soul. But then there are residue theories, and actually the world religion Buddhism has, at least in some of its versions, essentially a residue theory that says, nope, there is no stable soul that passes from one person to another. There is no Atman. And they refer to that doctrine as anatman. Just like in English, when you stick an "a" on the front of a word, it can mean not. Like this is atemporal, meaning it's not temporal. Well, anatman means no atman. And so it says there's no stable soul, and instead some kind of residue or something remains of a person, but it's not a soul. And it's that passes to the new person. In Buddhist literature, this is sometimes compared to one candle lighting another. The candles are distinct objects. One candle is not another candle, but a flame can pass between them. And in the same way, you have two different people who are genuinely different people, but something can pass between them that's responsible for these memories. In some parapsychological literature, you'll find people discussing thought bundles that might pass from one person to another. And so if somebody, let's say, dies a violent death, which is extremely common in these reincarnation cases, way more of the reported cases involve a violent death than you would expect based on how common violent deaths are in the population. Well, maybe if you're dying a violent death, you throw off lots of memory bundles, and these memories are floating out there in the environment, and then a pregnant mom or a small child walks through them, and they pick up these memories that are left over from somebody else, in which case a kind of residue has passed between individuals. Then there are psychic theories. And these basically involve the operation of some kind of psychic power, or ESP, that would allow information from one person to get to another person. Some of these involve a complex form of ESP, where the child would be drawing from multiple different sources and knitting that information together into these memories. And these are sometimes called super psi theories because of how complex the ESP would have to be to pull in all this information from multiple different sources. And the usual criticism of super ESP as an explanation is that it's too complex. And I agree with that. You don't need to propose complex ESP, assuming ESP exists, but then that's what we're trying to do, is explain a paranormal phenomenon here. I propose a theory that I actually haven't seen anyone else propose in episode 276. I propose that you could explain these memories in terms of a simple psychic link between the present person, typically a small child, and the previous person. And all the information just flows through a link between those two people. And I can imagine reasons, assuming psychic functioning exists, which is an assumption that we have to make here in order to consider this possibility. But if psychic functioning exists, I can imagine why such a link would form. If these accounts tend to happen in cultures that believe in reincarnation, like in India, for example. They do happen in other cultures, but they happen most often in cultures that do believe in reincarnation. So let's suppose, Psychelit, you're someone in India, you're a Hindu, you believe in reincarnation, and you're being violently murdered. You're desperate to survive. So being a believer in reincarnation, you might reach forward to some future child and try to impress your identity on that child as a way of surviving. So you might form a psychic link with that child and give them information about yourself. Yeah. On the other hand, it can work the other way potentially, because another characteristic of that's been noted in these cases is the previous person tends to live in a more favorable circumstance than the present person. So like if you're in India, let's say you're a member of the Lal caste, which is a workman's caste. Well, if you're a little Lal child, you could get special treatment if you say, hey, I'm a Brahmin. I'm from the highest caste, so you, my family, need to give me special treatment. And if I can produce memories of a Brahmin that turn out to be accurate, I can convince you and I can get special treatment. And that's going to help me better survive and better flourish. if I'm able to do that. And so there can be a reason why a living child in a reincarnation believing culture might reach back in time and find someone in a better circumstance that they could say, I'm him, so you owe me better treatment now. So there are, I think, a number of advantages to the psychic link theory. One of them is it explains the cross-cultural differences better than the soul theory or the residue theory, because it turns out that the reincarnation cases that get reported in each culture tend to follow the beliefs of that culture. So, for example, there are cultures that will say, things like, this is the case with the Druze, who are kind of an offshoot of Islam in Syria and Lebanon and Israel, places like that. The Druze believe that you reincarnate, but you can only come back as the same sex. They never report coming back as the other sex, and this psychic link theory could explain that. But for more information on all that, check out episode 276 of Mysterious World.
It's open forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Lots of folks on the line, so more questions for Jimmy right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or visit whywearecatholic.com.
Is relativism dead? It sure seems dead. Each day, new moral demands are made, and they are presented to us as absolutes. Everything, from transgender ideology to physician-assisted suicide, is presented as a moral good that all right-thinking people must accept. But Catholic Answers' own Carlo Broussard says look deeper, and you will see today's moralism is just relativism dressed up in new clothes. Carlo's eye-opening book, The New Relativism, shines a light on how the sacred moral teachings of this age cover up a deep denial of moral truth. Order your copy of The New Relativism today at shop.catholic.com and be prepared to defend the truth against aggressive relativism. The New Relativism at shop.catholic.com, or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
When has despair just become too much?
That's tomorrow's topic on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie on most of these EWTN stations.
Now back to Catholic Answers Live with Cy Kellett.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Probably should have before now, but happy Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Thanks for listening on the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the patroness of all of the Americas. We had a little bit of a retreat, and it may seem odd, but it was anything but odd that we went on a retreat with Chaldean priests today and got to celebrate the Mass and the Eucharistic prayer in Aramaic, right? The language of Jesus, yeah. And we had a wonderful time, so thank you to the local Chaldean community for letting us have their priests today, and thank you to Mary for converting Mexico and then all of the Americas, basically. 888-318-7884 is the number, 888-31-TRUTH. Jimmy Akin is our guest. John is in Indiana, and we're glad you're here. John, go ahead with your question.
All right, thanks. I appreciate it. My question is with regard to the Eucharist. And we know the body of Christ is there. Is it the glorified body, or is it perhaps the suffering body of Christ?
According to church teaching, it is the body of Christ glorified. In 1968, Pope Paul VI published a creed known as the Credo of the People of God. And in this creed, it professes that as Christians, as Catholics, we believe that the Eucharist contains the body of Christ now glorified in heaven. So it is Christ's heavenly body up in heaven right now that that becomes present in the Eucharist. Some people have proposed a sort of time warp theory where the Eucharist involves a time warp back to the day of the crucifixion in AD 33. So it would involve Christ's body on the cross when he was suffering. But this time warp theory, although I'm a big fan of time warps, is not something that has historically been contemplated and is actually contradicted by actual church teaching. The church's actual understanding and its actual teaching, as illustrated in the Credo of the People of God, is that it's Christ's glorified body today that is present in the Eucharist.
And was there any reason given by the Pope when he made that declaration?
Well, no, he didn't give a reason because it's a creed, and creeds just explain, here's what we believe. They don't explain why we believe that. But this has been the historic understanding down through Christianity, down through its history. You know, if you went and looked in Aquinas's thought, for example, and his explanation of the real presence, it's not going to involve a time warp. In fact, we really didn't have the idea that space and time could be bent before Albert Einstein at the beginning of the 20th century. He was the one that proposed that space and time are not absolutes, and so you can deform them by things like traveling really fast or getting into a gravity well or things like that. So this was not on the concept of a time warp was not on the intellectual map of theologians down through Christian history. So it's always been understood that it's Christ up in heaven who is appearing in the Eucharist.
John, we will leave it there because the phones are very busy, but thank you very much for that call and for that question. We go to our frequent friend, Emma in Hayden, Idaho, watching on YouTube. Welcome back, Emma.
Thank you, Cy. Thanks for taking my call. So in 2 Kings, it's kind of funny, but it's disturbing at the same time. Mm-hmm. When two boys are calling down to Elisha, calling him Baldy. So he summons two bears to come eat them. I mean, what's with that?
They don't eat them, but yeah. Also, unfortunately, the translation, this passage, as it's commonly translated in English Bibles, I think is potentially a little bit misleading because it in an English Bible, it will refer to these individuals that Elijah calls the bears on as youths or children or boys or things like that. And the Hebrew term actually can include young men. And I think that's part of what is going on here is there's this dynamic between young men who are, young and feeling their oats and feeling, hey, we're young, we're today, we're now. And here's this prophet who's old and decrepit and he's bald. And so you got this young man, old man tension going on here, kind of like the generation gap that people used to talk about here in America, never trust anyone over 30 and stuff like that. It appears, at least according to, and this is a mysterious passage, but it appears that another component of what may be going on here is a challenge to the God of Israel, to Yahweh. And this is not obvious to us English speakers, but there's an evangelical scholar named Michael Heiser who has talked about this, and it looks like there's some evidence that part of what the youth are doing is challenging the God of Israel and through his prophet. Elisha. And so one of the aspects that may be present in this text is not only the conflict between youth and age, but between the true religion and paganism. And that then brings another dimension into why Elijah might call upon the bears, not just because he is, or why he might curse the youth and then the bears maul them. They don't actually eat them, but they do attack them and maul them. And if he's been insulted as a prophet, and worse, if God is being insulted, then that's the kind of thing that could result in you getting cursed in the Old Testament and having problems with bears or something else. And so that seems to be, that's my best understanding of what's likely going on in this passage. If you'd like more information about that, as I said, Michael Heiser has talked about this, and you can Google or go on YouTube and put in Elisha, bears, and Michael Heiser, Heiser. Once again, Heiser, Michael Heiser.
Okay, Emma?
Thank you.
Emma?
Yes.
You live in grizzly bear country there in Idaho?
Not
No.
in the mountains. Yeah, they're about 50 miles north of us.
No, I didn't know if you were taking this personally. But all right, thanks, Emma. All right, bye. Let's go to Michelle in Massachusetts. Definitely not grizzly bear country, listening on 89.3 FM. Michelle, thank you for the call. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi. I have a question about St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 22. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. So I have heard a few different interpretations of this passage, and it seems like a lot of people agree that it means that wives are supposed to obey their husbands as their husbands are the heads of household, etc. But I noticed that the verse before, verse 21, says, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Yep.
So I kind of feel like the word subject, or be subject to, is talking about everyone, not just wives. So I'm wondering what it means to be subject to. Does that mean to obey, or does it mean something else?
Oh, great.
Well, it can incorporate obedience, but I think that, and it's hard to say, exactly what all the dimensions of this are, because it involves a general principle that's going to apply in different circumstances. One of the things that I think that this passage is reflecting is Jesus's principle that he articulates in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, where he gives a series of illustrations that all involve not pressing your rights. Like if someone insists that you go with him 1 mile, and this was something that Roman soldiers could do. They could impress a civilian into service and make them carry stuff for them for 1 mile. And he says, if someone does that, go with him 2 miles. He doesn't have a right to make you go 2 miles, but you don't have to insist on your rights. Similarly, he says if someone strikes your right cheek, offer him your left. Things like that. And what these illustrations have in common is not insisting on your rights, being generous of spirit and being willing to go the extra mile, to use an expression that has come from this exact passage in Matthew. And so when Paul articulates the general principle in Ephesians of be subject to one another for the sake of Christ, I think what he's doing is reflecting this teaching of Jesus, that we shouldn't just cling to our rights. We should be willing to go out of our way for other people and be generous of heart and do things that we don't have to do. Now, and I think that's a general Christian principle that applies to everybody, because Jesus doesn't say, wives, if someone makes you go with them 1 mile, go with them 2. In fact, a Roman centurion probably would not require, or a Roman soldier probably would not require a woman to carry stuff. He's actually going to be doing that of men. And so I think that this general principle of not insisting on our rights and going out of our way to help other people and do things for other people, that applies to everybody. And I think that's part of what Paul is articulating here. Now, that doesn't mean that it has no special application to wives. Because in the biblical vision of society, men do have special responsibilities in the family. They do have a distinct role. Christ compares the role of the husband in a family to the role of Christ in relationship to the church. And so, he tells women to, be subject to their husbands the way the church is subject to Christ, but he also turns around and says, and husbands, love your wives and sacrifice yourself for them the way Christ sacrificed himself for the church. So nobody's getting off scot-free here. Being subject to someone also doesn't mean you do absolutely everything they say. If someone gives you makes an unreasonable request or a positively damaging request, well, you don't got to do that. But what Paul is encouraging is a harmonious attitude in which everybody in the church has this attitude of generosity of heart and willing to go out of their way for someone else. And he also applies it concretely in the family. So husbands need to have self-sacrificing love for their wives, which actually requires more of the husband than it does of the wife. Wives are not called to sacrifice themselves for their husbands, but husbands are called to sacrifice themselves like Christ did for his church, if that's what's required. So even though this is something that, is a hot button topic in our culture right now, what Paul is ultimately trying to do is paint a vision of social interactions, including within the family, that are reasonable and loving and wholesome and balanced. So nobody is like king of the hill and gets to just do what they want with no restraints and no concern for other people.
Michelle, what do you think?
That was helpful. Thank you. I guess I'm assuming, does the church have specific teaching on this, or is this kind of open to interpretation kind of a topic?
There's considerable flexibility here for different opinions. Historically, right, you would have more emphasis on obedience on the part of the wife, and if you look at recent magisterial documents, like from the time of John Paul II forward, there's more emphasis on balance. And so I would say this is an area where, as society has changed, the church has had to think more carefully about all this, and we haven't yet arrived at a final version of this teaching. And the church is presently allowing exegetes and biblical scholars and theologians to ponder this subject and propose different ways of living out these principles.
Michelle, thank you. That brings us to the break, so we will be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
EWTN's religious catalog has terrific suggestions for Christmas gifts. Women Made New, Reflections on Adversity, Transformation, and Healing by Kristalina Everett features the captivating stories of 12 women who overcame personal trials to become champions for the kingdom of God. The Women Made New book and DVD set is one of many great Christmas gifts from EWTN Religious Catalog. For more, visit EWTNRC.com today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin's our guest today, both hours, and it's open forum. So perfect time to call because there's a line open. Perfect time to get your question into Jimmy. Anyone's welcome to call 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884. Jimmy, of course, is the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, and I don't believe I have asked you yet, Jimmy. What's dropping what's dropping on Friday this week?
We're going to be looking at what the historical evidence says about the tomb of Christ. So there are different proposals for where the tomb of Christ is located. You have some scholars, even use the word loosely, who have even proposed that there was no tomb of Christ, that he was just dumped in a common grave, or maybe it was even eaten by wild dogs or something like that after the crucifixion. But then there are other reports of where his tomb would have been, including places as far away as Japan.
Really?
And, yeah.
Wow. Good for Joseph of Arimathea.
Yeah, and other places you would not expect. So we're going to be taking a look at what the historical evidence says. We're going to be looking at, do we have evidence that he actually was buried in a tomb, including beyond the Gospels? Do we have evidence for where that tomb was? And what about all these alternative proposed sites? And can we establish the site in Jerusalem can we establish one site in Jerusalem that has the best historical evidence pointing to it as opposed to other sites? And the answer is yes, we can. There are at least 3 sites in Jerusalem that have been proposed as Jesus' tomb, and the evidence clearly supports one of those 3 sites over the others.
All right. It drops Friday morning. All you got to do is put in your computer, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. You can get it where you get podcasts. You can get it on YouTube. And coming this Friday, where's Jesus' tomb? Up next, Kyle in San Antonio, Texas, listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Kyle, thank you for downloading our app onto your phone. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, guys. So I just kind of wanted to preface my question by saying that I'm a fairly new Catholic. I was baptized back in Easter 2020.
Well, welcome home, brother.
Yeah, thank you. I know. I'm glad to be a part of it. And so one of the things that really got me interested in the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith was the Apocrypha, and that, we have books that aren't included in other Bibles, like Protestants and all that stuff. And so one day I was talking with my friend about it, and he's not baptized, but he's very well versed in Christianity and the readings and Jesus' teachings and all that. And when I mentioned the Apocrypha to him, he talked about how that was just some books that were kind of just like added in later by the Council of Trent, I think it was, just to, fit doctrine or whatever. And so I did some research while I was at my work, and I just had some questions about it. So I guess the first one would be the difference between what is the Deuterocanon, because that was one thing that came up a lot, was why do we call it Deuterocanon, and the difference between that and the Apocrypha, and then also why did it take so long up to the Protestant Reformation for those books to become canonized?
All right.
Okay, so in regard to the first question, the term Deuterocanonical is used, or Deuterocanonicals, is used in Catholic circles and some other circles for essentially the same books that Protestants refer to as the Apocrypha. The term Apocrypha is essentially the Protestant term for the Deuterocanonicals, though there are a few exceptions. There are a few books that are often classified as Apocrypha by Protestants that are not actually in the Catholic canon. And some of them are in, some Eastern Orthodox canons, but they're not considered canonical by Catholics. And so with the exception of 3 or 4 books, the Deuterocanonicals and the Apocrypha are the same thing. They include the same books. So that's 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, Esther, Baruch, and the Deuterocanonical portions of Daniel and Esther, as well as Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach. so we're essentially talking about the same set of books with a few exceptions. In terms of being canonized, well, actually, no, they were canonized earlier. Canonization is a process whereby a book is recognized as being canonical, and these books had a long history of being recognized as canonical. What happened, though, and that, we can show that, for example, that they were considered canonical by looking at councils that occurred towards the end of the 300s, like the Council of Rome in the year 382. It included the Deuterocanonicals. So did the councils of more than one council of Carthage and the Council of Hippo. These all occurred in the late 300s and the beginning of the 400s. And these were local councils, but they recognized these books as canonical. And so they considered them part of the canon. So they had been canonized in the view of these different local councils, which represented churches over, broad swaths of territory, both in the Italian peninsula and also in North Africa. And these reflected the common opinion of Christians all over the place. If you look, for example, at the book Early Christian Doctrines by the Protestant scholar J.N.D. Kelly, he notes that the canon, with very few exceptions, was always considered as including more than what's in the Protestant Old Testament. It also included these Deuterocanonical works. Now, that didn't mean everybody agreed, because this had not yet been infallibly defined. And so, there were individuals here and there that had their own views on this. But broadly speaking, these were recognized by Christians in general as being part of the canon. Then in the 1400s, at the Council of Florence, there was an attempt made to reconcile with some Eastern Christians who did not recognize these books. And so the Council of Florence spelled out a list of books in the canon that included them. And so this was not an infallible decree. At least it's arguably not an infallible decree, but it did list these. And then in the 1500s, you had Protestantism began, and all of a sudden you had a major movement that was denying the canonicity of these books. Well, that went in the face of the fact these books had been accepted broadly by Christians all the way down through history. And all of a sudden you have a big movement saying these are not Scripture. And it was at that point that the church felt the need to infallibly define this. They'd already been canonized earlier, but now the church was doing it infallibly so that there would be no doubt in Catholic circles that these are part of the Bible. And so that's why Trent infallibly defined them. There's more to say about all this, but we're getting close to the end of the hour. So what I'd like to do, Kyle, is send you a copy of a book that I wrote all about the history of the Bible, including these parts. It's called The Bible is a Catholic Book. And if you hang on the line, then we'll send you a copy of The Bible is a Catholic Book, and you can read more about all this history.
Kyle, thanks. I appreciate the call. Let's go to Rob in Pennsylvania watching on YouTube. Rob, we are coming near the end of the hour. Can you be quick with your question for Jimmy?
I can be quick. First of all, love you guys. It's good to once again be speaking to Gandalf the Red and the Venerable Saint Sai, but I will make this fast. I love the way you do things. You can do things basic, Jimmy. So could you explain to us a feast day? What are you supposed to feast on? Is it food or the subject matter of the day? Is there procedures to feast days?
Okay. Rob, I'm going to let him answer because we're coming up on the hour here.
So a feast day historically was a day on which you would feast on food. And if you want to feast on food on a feast day, you can do that. These days, what's required is on a feast day is certain adaptations in the liturgy that are meant to encourage the faithful to remember whatever the feast is celebrating and contemplate its spiritual significance. So if you want to observe a feast day, one way of doing that is go to Mass, participate in the liturgy, including the Liturgy of the Hours, contemplate whatever it is that the feast day is celebrating. If you want to eat special food on that day, you can do that. If it's a holy day of obligation, there are a few more things like you got to go to Mass and you should rest from anything that will interfere with your enjoyment of the day, if possible. But just in terms of a plain old regular feast day, if you want to celebrate it voluntarily, contemplate the mystery of the day or the saint of the day and their spiritual significance, and participate in the liturgy if you can.
Thanks, Rob. Great question for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is not a holy day of obligation here in the U.S. I don't know if it is anywhere. And
maybe Mexico.
Maybe Mexico, yeah. That brings us to the top of the hour. We'll take a very quick break. We'll be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin. Couple lines open, 888-318-7884. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live on this Tuesday afternoon. Thanks so much for being here with us. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and it is open forum. And lines are full, so I will head back to the lines. Jimmy, of course, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, and I'm looking forward to this Friday's episode where it's like an in search of the real tomb of Jesus.
Yep.
And I know you and I were both fans of the show In Search Of.
Oh, yeah, Leonard Nimoy.
That was a great one. Yeah.
There's actually a podcast devoted to the show In Search Of, which for people who may not be aware, it was like a 30-minute documentary show from back in the 1970s where after Star Trek, Leonard Nimoy hosted this show, and he he basically was the presenter, of the show. He didn't do the research, but he was the presenter of the show. And it looked at mysterious things like Atlantis and psychic functioning and historical mysteries like Amelia Earhart and stuff like that. And there's a podcast that some skeptics do that's devoted to the show called In Research Of. Oh. And one of where they look at each episode, they look at an old episode of In Search Of, and then they talk about it in light of what they think modern research would say about it. And, I don't always agree with their conclusions, but I've listened to a number of episodes of the podcast, and it's entertaining. One of the fun segments they have in each show is the 1970s Leonard Nimoy fashion update, where they talk about all the groovy 1970s business wear that he's wearing as
that
presenter.
Is some nice stuff with wide lapels. I got to check that one out. That's very cool. All right, but you should check out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World this Friday, In Search Of the Tomb of Jesus. The number here is 888-31-TRUTH. We're off to Chicago now. Marty is in Chicago listening to EWTN on Channel 130, Sirius XM Satellite Radio. Marty, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, Jimmy. My question is in regards to prayer versus verbal prayer versus silent prayer, and whether the saints can read your mind as well as the angels, and can the devil hear when you're doing silent prayer versus verbal prayer?
Okay. So the answer is we don't have church teaching on any of these questions. So this is a matter of theological speculation and theological opinion. So I'll tell you what the historic answer has been, and then I'll tell you what I think the options are that are a little bit better grounded. Historically, so if you go back to, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, and he wasn't alone in this, but he's a representative of this school of thought. Aquinas said that that only God knows the human heart, because there is a verse that in the Old Testament that said only God knows the human heart, and so he took that as an absolute. God is the only one who knows the heart of man, but he had an issue. Then how do we explain how angels communicate? Because angels don't have physical forms. They don't have bodies, they don't have lips, they don't have ears. But we do know that they communicate with each other. They exchange information. And so Aquinas' way of explaining that was essentially a form of what you could call broadcast telepathy, where one angel, in order to communicate with another angel, broadcasts what it's thinking to the other angel. So angels can't read your mind. They can, on this version of telepathy, hear what you telepathically shout at them, but they can't read each other's minds. So if Gabriel is talking to Michael cannot read what Gabriel is thinking. Gabriel has to telepathically shout it at Michael in order for Michael to pick up on what Gabriel's thinking. Now, hypothetically, something like that could also happen with humans. I am not aware of a passage where Aquinas discusses this particular form of ESP, telepathy being a form of ESP, but Aquinas does believe in other forms of ESP as natural human abilities, like precognition. He thinks is a natural human ability. He calls it natural prophecy to distinguish it from the supernatural prophecy that God gives. So hypothetically, Aquinas might be open to a kind of broadcast telepathy among humans, but he's going to say that neither the saints in heaven can read your mind without you talking to them. And he's also going to say the same thing for demons, that they can't read your mind. But if you shout telepathically, so to speak, at a saint, well, then he might be open to the saint hearing that. But his preferred theory is that God picks up on it. If you're praying silently, God will know what you're praying, and then God will pass that information to the saint that you're praying to. So if you want, let's say, the biblical patriarch Abraham to pray for you, and you're saying, Saint Holy Abraham, please pray for this, then God will let Abraham know and say, okay, Psychelet, Abraham is praying for you, or Abraham Psychelet is praying, to you right now. He'd like you to pray for this. And then Abraham could intercede. So that's Aquinas' preferred theory of how saints get the information from silent prayer. He's going to say that devils can't read your mind because he thinks nobody but God knows what's in your heart. He might be open to it, though, if you tried to mentally, silently tell the devil something. Well, then presumably the devil might learn of it that way. Just like if you've got two angels talking to each other, like, if Gabriel is broadcasting his thoughts to Michael, Michael will learn those thoughts. Well, if Gabriel broadcasted his thoughts to the devil would learn Gabriel's thoughts. And if you broadcast your thoughts to the devil deliberately, he might be able to learn them. But Aquinas is still going to say he can't read your mind without you actively trying to communicate. But then he's going to take the edge off of that. He's what Aquinas gives with one hand, saying you've got mental privacy from the devil and that he can't directly read your mind. He's going to take away with it, what he gives with the right hand, he's going to take away with the left, because he's going to say that demons are, like angels in general, are so much smarter than us that they could read our body language in a way that will allow them to deduce what we're thinking in a large majority of situations. And so consequently, even if it's by deduction, kind of like Sherlock Holmes, what is this person thinking? They can effectively use deduction to achieve the effect of telepathy. And so that's what Aquinas and a lot of other people would say. They can effectively know your thoughts, even if it's not technically reading your mind. Now, that's the common historical view of this. But this is not a matter of church teaching, so it's not the only possible view, and other people can and have had other opinions. And that would include me. I think that there are a number of flaws or grounds for criticism of this view. The first one is I think that this view is being motivated by a bad interpretation, because what is motivating this view is that verse in the Old Testament that says only God knows the heart of man. I think they're taking that in a way too absolute sense. I don't think the biblical author is envisioning, because this is an Old Testament verse, he's not envisioning saints up in heaven or angels listening to your thoughts. He's talking about other human beings here on earth. And among other human beings here on earth, well, they tend not to know what your heart is. That's why we can deceive each other. And so consequently, the point he's making is only God ultimately really knows what's happening inside of us. But the universe of discourse he's operating in is the human family. He's saying nobody in the human family ultimately knows what's in your heart. only God knows that. But he's not thinking about saints and angels. That's not part of the universe he's imagining. And so I don't think you can draw any inferences about saints or angels from this when what he's thinking is living humans don't know what you're thinking. Only God does. So I think that this view is motivated by a bad inference. Also, I think that there actually is some evidence, and this is recent, but there actually is some evidence for telepathy, where one person can learn a thought, not necessarily know everything that's going on in their heart, but can learn something about what another person is thinking. And this is without that other person trying to broadcast the information. For example, there's been research done on what are called bonded pairs. These are people who are emotionally bonded with each other, like a husband and a wife, or a parent and a child, or two identical twins. And there is evidence that, especially in bonded pairs, people can sometimes pick up on what's going on with the other person in the pair. And there are lots of historically reported experiences, for example, that like when one member of a bonded pair is in trouble, they're in a life or death crisis, the other member of the bonded pair will suddenly know it, even though the first member of the bonded pair is not trying to broadcast their thoughts. The other member just knows it. And so that looks like telepathy, where there is a form of information being communicated spontaneously without deliberate effort between the two people. And thus that mind reading rather than mind broadcasting looks like it is possible. And there have been scientific studies of that more recently that have seemed to confirm that. On the other hand, I think that that the theory, and so in light of that, I couldn't rule out that the saints in heaven may be telepathic enough to hear your mental prayers. I don't know that that's the case, but I can't rule it out either. What I can say is, even if they're not telepathic enough to do that, God is. And so God can give them the information, just like on Aquinas's preferred theory. When it comes to demons, I agree with Aquinas that they're so smart, they can deduce what you're thinking from subtle signs, even without telepathy. Mm-hmm. In fact, we today have the beginnings of what's known as mechanical telepathy or machine telepathy, where you can do a brain scan of someone, and by looking at their brain activity, you can tell what they're thinking. And this is going to let people who are mentally locked in and can't communicate in the future. They're already doing that, and it'll only get better with time. So if we can have a CAT scan that reveals your brain activity in a way that we can tell what you're thinking, well, angels are going to be able to do that too. Angels are going to be able to look into your head and see what your brain activity is and tell exactly what you're thinking. And that's going to apply to good angels, and that's going to apply to bad angels. So even if angels didn't have mind-reading telepathy, I think they could still tell exactly what you're thinking in detail. And I also think that because the Bible verse about this has been misinterpreted, and we have evidence for human telepathy, we would have evidence for angelic ability to read minds as well. But we don't need to worry about that because God protects us. So who cares if demons can overhear what you're thinking or deduce what you're thinking? We're under God's protection, so we don't need to worry about that.
Marty, thank you so much for that question. That brings us to the break. Right back with more Open Forum right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Your questions, Catholic Answers Live. Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
How should we pray? The disciples asked our Lord that question, and he gave them the Our Father, or the Lord's Prayer. But he also gave them the liturgy, which is the most privileged form of prayer in the Catholic tradition, especially the holy sacrifice of the Mass. We can pray with the whole Church in the liturgy of the hours or the divine office, and we should also pray in our own private room, our secret chamber, as Jesus says, and then our Father who sees us in secret will reward us.
Welcome back, Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Aiken is our guest. Open forum means anybody can call with any question. 888-318-7884. Deborah's in Canada, watching on YouTube. Deborah, thank you very much for your patience. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. My question is the churches and Jimmy's thoughts on near-death experience. I did experience something, and I don't know if you call it near-death because I was code blue, so I guess they said my heart stopped.
Yeah, that's near-death.
And this was a few years back, and what I experienced was very peaceful. There was no break. It was this very seamless. I was not in my body, but my awareness and I guess consciousness was the very same. And I never saw anything, but I felt and heard. There were women around me. I said, I need to go back for my children. And they said, it's okay, dear, you're going to go back. Your children still need you. Now then, I did come back out of it and everything and woke up to chaos in the emergency room. But it never changed my faith. I always had a very strong faith. It hasn't made me any more faithful because I've always had a strong faith in God. And I just wondered, what does the church think of that? And also, why do some people experience that and not everyone?
Okay, so the church does not have a teaching on near-death experience. Near-death experiences are being studied from a scientific perspective, and the church has a healthy respect for science. And so, it's certainly open to what science may end up saying about these experiences. From a scientific perspective, there is a question about how do we interpret them. Could they be the product of just natural forces or natural causes that are at operation when we're in a near-death crisis and our brain is shutting down? Or could they indicate survival after death? And I would have to say, based on my study of them, that they constitute evidence pointing to survival after death, and that our consciousness is not strictly dependent on the operation of our brain. So our consciousness can function independently of the brain, and there are various indicators that are just very difficult to explain if you have a purely naturalistic theory of near-death experiences. For example, individuals will come back from near-death experiences sometimes with what is referred to as veridical knowledge, meaning knowledge that you didn't know beforehand, but that turns out to be accurate when you investigate it. You've even got a little bit of veridical knowledge in your own experience, Deborah, because you perceived that you were told you're going to go back, and then you went back. So that turned out to be true. Now, unfortunately, that's not the kind of knowledge that could be used in a scientific study of near-death experiences, because only you had access to what you were told. There's no way to verify that. It's just people would have to take your word. But there are situations involving near-death experiences where people came back and had information that could be verified. For example, there is a particular case that occurred, I want to say it was in the 1970s, but it occurred here in the United States, and a migrant worker from Mexico named Maria had a cardiac arrest, and they took her into a hospital, and she had a near-death experience. She saw her body from above, and then she mentally kind of went on a tour of the hospital, which she did not know. You know, she'd never been in this hospital before. They just wheeled her in on the ground floor. But she goes on this tour of the hospital, and one of the things she sees is a shoe, a single shoe, on a ledge outside of a window on one of the upper floors where it couldn't be seen, you know, as they were wheeling her in. And it's got some scuffing on one side of the shoe, and it's got a shoelace that's kind of draped around and tucked under it. And then they restarted her heart. And when she was back, she started talking, and of course this was all in Spanish, but she started talking. She found a hospital worker who knew Spanish and was telling her about this experience she'd had, and she was really insistent, and she wanted the hospital worker to go find the shoe because it would verify that her experience was real. And the hospital worker went on a tour. She started looking around on the floor, on the upper floors. She found the shoe. And it was exactly like what Maria had described. It was scuffed on this one side. It had the shoelace wrapped around it. It was a single shoe. It was the same color. It was the same make. Everything was the same. This was a real shoe. So this was a piece of veridical information that Maria couldn't have guessed, because most hospitals don't have shoes sitting on the ledges outside of windows. And this was beyond random chance, and it turned out to be true and verifiable. And so there are instances like this where people come back with information that can be verified. Another kind of experience that's like this is what's known as a peak in Darien experience. This is a reference to a line in an old poem about some explorers in Darien province, Panama, and they get up to the top of a mountain peak, and suddenly they unexpectedly see the Pacific Ocean. So a peak in Darien experience is an experience connected with death where you unexpectedly see something and it turns out to be true. And specifically what happens in peak in Darien experiences, they can happen before a person dies or while they're under cardiac arrest. But, you know, people report frequently being greeted either by deceased loved ones or by angels or things like that. And sometimes they will be greeted by deceased loved ones who they know, you know, like, okay, grandma is here and she's greeting me, and grandpa's here and he's greeting me. But then, wait, what is my little sister doing here? My little sister is still alive. And then when they come back from the experience, you know, they unexpectedly see the little sister. That's someone they're not expecting to be dead. That's the peak in Darien experience. And then when they come back, when, like, once they get their heart restarted or something, they say, well, I had this experience and I saw grandma and I saw grandpa, but then I saw my little sister and she's not dead. And then they say, actually, your little sister is dead and we didn't want to tell you because of how sick you were. And they'll find out that they've just seen someone who was dead that they did not previously know was dead. And so that's further veridical evidence suggesting that this person got accurate information through this experience with the afterlife. And so because of veridical information like this, I don't think you can easily explain near-death experiences in purely naturalistic terms. And so I take them as what they are. I think they are experiences that point to an afterlife. When someone experiences cardiac arrest, they're clinically dead, and I think they're experiencing the early stages of the afterlife. And it not everyone reports the same things. Now, you asked, for example, Deborah, why doesn't everyone have them when they get when they clinically die and then are brought back? And you're right, not everybody has them. Current statistics indicate something like maybe 15% of people have these or report having them. And there's speculation about why that is. One of the leading speculations is when someone is brought back from cardiac arrest, they're pumping you full of drugs, and the drugs may interfere with the memory formation process. So it could be everybody's having these experiences, but between the trauma of coming back and having your heart restarted and the drugs they're putting you on, it may block your memories. You may not be able to remember the experience you had. In fact, some of the drugs they put people on in situations like this are actually designed to interfere with memory formation. There's a drug known as Versed, which its purpose is to block short-term memory formation so they can, for example, do a medical procedure on you that may not be the most fun medical procedure, and they don't want you to remember it. I've actually been put on Versed when I had cataract surgery in my eyes. I was conscious during the surgery, but they put me on Versed so I wouldn't remember the surgeries. Unfortunately, they didn't put me on enough Versed because I remember both surgeries in detail. But it could be these drugs and the physical trauma of coming back that may be why some people don't remember the near-death experiences that they actually had.
Deborah, thank you. Thank you very much for that call. Lots of interesting calls today. More to come right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Are you scared to talk about abortion? Don't worry, almost everyone is. You can overcome this fear as Trent Horn shows in the newly revised and expanded second edition of Persuasive Pro-Life. With a little knowledge and a few proven techniques, you can become a bold and effective apologist for life. Visit shop.catholic.com to order your copy of Persuasive Pro-Life and never again be afraid to speak up. Also available at good Catholic bookstores.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Is relativism dead? It sure seems dead. Each day, new moral demands are made and they are presented to us as absolutes. Everything, from transgender ideology to physician-assisted suicide, is presented as a moral good that all right-thinking people must accept. But Catholic Answers' own Carlo Broussard says look deeper, and you will see today's moralism is just relativism dressed up in new clothes. Carlo's eye-opening book, The New Relativism, shines a light on how the sacred moral teachings of this age cover up a deep denial of moral truth. Order your copy of The New Relativism today at shop.catholic.com and be prepared to defend the truth against aggressive relativism. The New Relativism at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
When has despair just become too much?
That's tomorrow's topic on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie on most of these EWTN stations.
Now back to Catholic Answers Live with Cy Kellett.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Aiken, our guest. It's open forum. That means anybody can call with any question at all. I sometimes do that and it rhymes and I regret it. I'm not trying to make a rhyme there, but there it is. 888-318-7884 is the
you know
number.
what the common rhyme is for that situation?
Oh, no, I don't.
Which I've never thought was particularly clever, but it is the common saying when someone unintentionally rhymes.
I know.
Yeah.
You're a poet, but you don't know it.
Didn't know it.
Didn't
yeah.
know it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're right. That's not particularly clever.
Yeah.
It's not even. At least make a good poem if you're going to do a poem about accidentally making a poem.
It's more of a couplet.
Yeah. Right. Landon's in North Carolina watching on YouTube. Landon, Awful glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy. No? Oh, Landon, we've been waiting for you. Well, no, you've been waiting for us. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said we've been waiting for you, but we've been looking forward to your call.
For him too, yeah.
But are you there, Landon, in North Carolina? I really want you to get this question. Oh, there you are. Okay. Whoosh-oo. Oh.
Yeah, I'm here.
All
Can
right.
you hear me?
Yes. Did we lull you to sleep with our poetry talk? Is that what happened, Landon?
No, I was here. I think my thing just didn't connect.
Oh, okay. Well, we're glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Yeah, so I recently stumbled across a video. It was this gentleman talking about how the God of Israel was based on some Canaanite god that went by the same name of Yahweh. I was just wondering if Jimmy had any insight on that, maybe any kind of things I could use to argue against that.
Well, so there's an element of truth here, but if the video said it the way you just said it, there's also an element of distortion. The element of truth is that it wasn't just the Israelites who worshiped Yahweh. We have evidence that other people in the ancient Near East also worshiped Yahweh. And one of the ways we know that is because we have the names of people recorded from some of these ancient Near Eastern societies. And one of the common things that parents in the ancient Near East did was they would incorporate the name of a god into the names of their children. And we see this, for example, in the Old Testament. So, for example, Daniel in Hebrew it means Don. It's Don-E-L, and Don means judge. E is a suffix that means my, and L is the word for God. So Daniel means God is my judge. Similarly, Elijah's name, Eliyahu in Hebrew. So L means God. E, as I said, is a suffix that means my, and Yahu is a shortened form of Yahweh. So Elijah or Eliyahu means God, or Yahweh is my God. And that element of the name that of the child's name that corresponds to the name of God is known as the theophoric element. Theos in Greek means God, and the phoros part means carrying. So it's the part of the name that carries the God's name. Yahu in the case of Elijah, and El in the case of Daniel. And other people in the ancient Near East did this too. This was very popular. They didn't always name their kids with a god's name as part of it, but they, like, for example, Deborah means bee, and Jonah means dove. But they did this an awful lot, and other peoples did this too. For example, they did it in Egypt. In Egypt, whenever you see a name like that has a hotep in it, hotep means is pleased, and then the theophoric part of the name is going to be the other part. So if the name is Amun-hotep, that's going to the theophoric part is Amun. The god Amun, the hidden god. So Amun-hotep means Amun is pleased. Tutankhamun means, King Tut. Tutankhamun, well, Tut means living, Tut means image, Ankh means living, Amun is a god. So Tutankhamun is the living image of Amun, and so forth. So we can look just by having the names of people in documents and inscriptions and so forth, we can tell what gods they were worshiping because they put the name of the god in their kids' names. And we do find outside of Israel some people apparently worshiping a god called Yahweh. Okay, so that's the element of truth here. But does that allow you to say that the Israelite God Yahweh is based on or a copy of some other deity or a pagan deity? No, it just means more than one group of people was worshiping God. So, it doesn't tell you anything about the causality of this. It doesn't tell you that the Israelites got this concept from these other people. It doesn't tell you that the other people got this concept from the Israelites. And those are just naturalistic theories. There's also the supernaturalistic option of Yahweh made contact with the human race and revealed himself to the human race. And some people started worshiping Yahweh. And some of those people were Israelites and some of them weren't. But that doesn't mean he's not a real God who didn't really reveal himself to humanity. So a reductionistic idea that would say, oh, the Israelites just copied these other people. You don't know that at all. That's not what the data allows you to infer. The data allows you to infer that more than the Israelites were worshiping Yahweh. But beyond that, you can't make any reasonable inferences about whether Yahweh is real or whether he made contact with humanity or not.
Landon, what do you think?
Yeah, that helps out a lot, especially the idea of the theophoric names. Kind of answered my question.
Okay.
About his influence existing in other cultures other than the Israelites.
Well, thank you very much, Landon. Appreciate the call. I'm going to go to Elizabeth right here in California. Elizabeth, thank you for the call. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello. I have a question for Jimmy. I'm Catholic, and I have an eating disorder. Now, I know gluttony is a sin, and I'm good for a period of time, and then when I start stress eating, and then I know I need to go to confession I'm at this point where every 2-3 weeks lately I've been going to confession, and I don't know if I'm doing the right thing or not, or what should I do. And I have been listening to you, Jimmy, your videos on intermittent fasting, so it's been helping me with that.
Oh, good.
But regarding going to confession after stress eating, I don't smoke, I don't do drugs, but when I get very stressed out, I eat. Okay.
Well, and so you're asking, do you need to confess the sin of gluttony?
Yes.
Okay. Without knowing anything further, I would say you probably don't. First of all, the sin of gluttony is it's what's classified or commonly called one of the 7 deadly sins. And these aren't really sins. The 7 deadly sins are tendencies that can lead us to deadly sin, but they're not themselves sinful. What they are is temptations. It would be better, instead of calling them the 7 deadly sins, if we called them the 7 deadly temptations, because that's all they really are. And are people sometimes tempted to eat too much? Yeah, sure. But that doesn't make it a mortal sin that needs to be confessed. In order for a mortal sin to occur, grave damage has to occur. And normally when people eat too much, they're not doing grave damage to their body. Grave damage would be something like, you're likely to have a heart attack and you just devour 3 pizzas, not caring that you're likely to have a heart attack at the time that you eat the 3 pizzas. Okay, that could be a mortal sin because you're recklessly endangering your life. Or if you knew that you were likely to have a stroke and do grave damage to your body and you don't care, you're going to eat 2 tubs of ice cream, knowing that you're likely to have 2 gallons of ice cream, knowing that you're going to have likely to have a stroke. Okay, that could be a mortal sin. But normally when people overeat, there ain't no grave damage. And so normally when people overeat, it's only a venial sin at most. And so I would say the odds that you're actually committing a mortal sin that needs to be confessed in these circumstances is very low. And it's okay to be on a diet and have a break. a cheat day, as they call it. That's one of the things that can help motivate you to stay on a diet or eating plan, is the idea that I can have a little bit of variation. If I'm under stress, I can take a day off and, let myself have things that I otherwise wouldn't have on my eating plan. So, it may not be a sin at all. But if it is a sin, unless you're seriously endangering your health with grave damage from an individual act of eating, you're not committing a mortal sin by that individual act of eating, and you don't need to confess it. So I would say go easier on yourself and recognize that that even though you may have some issues you need to work on in this area, it sounds like you're addressing them, and you don't need to be terrified that by having an extra sandwich or an extra serving or whatever it is, that you're committing a mortal sin that you need to confess. Because unless your health is so precarious that you risk doing grave damage on that occasion, you're not committing a mortal sin.
Elizabeth, thank you for the call. I appreciate that. And you're here locally in California. If you'd like a copy of it, just give us your address and we'll send you a copy of Jimmy's The Words of Eternal Life, True Happiness and Where to Find It. I like that book a lot, and I hope that you will as well. It's break time, however, so I've got to take the break. We'll be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
In Morse code, the sequence SOS is a distress call. It's been said that it stands for Save Our Souls. Well, right now our world is in big trouble, and we're putting out an SOS call for help. Will you answer that call? St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, has hundreds of teams who share the good news with souls who don't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to get involved.
Are you a new listener to EWTN Radio? Welcome. We're here for you 24/7.
You'll hear live and interactive shows throughout the day to answer any questions you may have about the Catholic faith.
There's trustworthy news from a Catholic perspective.
And a large selection of podcasts available at EWTN's Podcast Central.
And, of course, the daily Mass, prayers, and everything you need to edify your soul.
Welcome to EWTN Radio. We're blessed to have you with us.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and lots of folks on the line still. So back we go to the phones. Julia is in Imperial, Nebraska, watching on YouTube. Julia, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, Jimmy. So I teach 5th grade CCD, and we're kind of talking about, who God is and focusing a little bit on Jesus and how he's fully God and fully man. And when I explained that to my students, that kind of threw them for a loop. And, I guess their understanding of it was that God was half human, half God. And so I tried my best to explain it to them, but I was hoping maybe I could get some help on how to explain to 5th graders how Jesus is fully God and fully man.
Well, so it depends on how they're conceptualizing this half human, half God thing. Because there's a mistaken way, and then there's a way that can be reasonable. So Jesus has two parts. He has a divine part, his divine nature, and he has a human part, his human nature. So if you want to say that he's part human and part divine, you can say that. If you want to say that, that can be understood in a reasonable way. He's got these two parts. On the other hand, if you want to say, okay, we're going to count each part as a half, well, you can do that, and say he's half human, half divine in a sense. But there are some problems with that. The first problem is his divine nature is infinite and his human nature is finite. So how does this half thing work if one side is infinite and one side is finite? Psychelet, if I added an infinite quantity of, let's say, wheat, to a recipe, and a finite quantity of cherries to the recipe, could I say that the resulting pie is half wheat and half cherry?
Jimmy, come on, math. No, I don't think you could, because
I was cloaking it in terms of food. I thought that would make it easier.
Yeah, I think infinite is something. Nothing finite can be half of what's infinite.
Right. And so that's the first problem with using language like half divine and half human, although that's not to say you can't understand it in a legitimate sense if by half you mean one of the two parts of his nature is human and one of the two of his person is human and one of the two parts of his person is divine. But then there's another problem, which is if you think of someone as half one thing and half another, then you may understand it as this person is not fully either. So, for example, let's take Mr. Spock as an example. He's half human because he has a human mother, and he's half Vulcan, so he's got a human Vulcan father. So that means he's not fully human or fully Vulcan. He's a hybrid. He's part both, but not fully either. And you could do the same thing. You don't have to involve Vulcans. You could do it here on Earth. If someone is, half of African ancestry and half of European ancestry, well, they're not fully European or fully African in their ancestry. They're part both. And that's not the way Jesus is. He's not partly divine and partly human. He's fully divine and fully human. So I think the key to helping the fifth graders or anybody else understand the incarnation is to understand these are complete natures. He has a complete divine nature, so he's fully God, and he has a complete human nature, including a human spirit, so he's fully human. And if you're clear on that point, that he's not like it's not like he's got two DNA strands and one of them is divine and one of them is human. He's fully divine and fully human. He's got the two complete natures. That's the key point that needs to be understood in this area. Does that help, Julia?
I think so. And is there a way to explain that, like, human soul, but also God aspect?
Well, it's simply just restating what I already said. Humans have a soul and a body. So since Jesus, and you're not a full human if you don't have a soul and a body. So since Jesus is fully human, he's got a human soul and a human body. And then since he has a divine nature, he's also got his divinity.
And I tell you what, I'm going to leave it there. And God bless you for the work that you do teaching, and thank you for that. But I want to get as many on as I can before we have to go. And Andrew is in Los Angeles, California. Andrew, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Jimmy. Thank you. So my question today, it's from three passages in the Bible. One from the Lord Himself, and it has to do with wealth. So my question is, in Proverbs 23:4, it says, "Do not toil to acquire wealth." Then there's different definitions that I went through. Where there's one where it says, "Be discerning enough to desist. Don't wear yourself out trying to get rich. Be wise enough to know when to quit," and so forth. And I want to know. Jesus said to the rich man, the Lord didn't say it's impossible, but he said it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a needle to travel through a camel's eye. So at those parts, I'm wondering, I know.
Okay, let me take a swing at this, and because we're getting low on time and we have some other folks we need to get on. So in terms of the Proverbs passage that you mentioned, it's essential to recognize the genre of what a proverb is. A proverb is not a law; it is a wise saying, and so we shouldn't treat them as absolute rules. Like when it says in Proverbs, don't try to get rich. What it means is getting rich is not the most important thing in life. There are other things that are more important. And so it's saying what it means is don't have riches as your highest priority. I can also illustrate how Proverbs are not exceptionalist rules by the fact two of my favorite Proverbs are right next to each other. One of them says, answer a fool according to his folly, and the other says, answer not a fool according to his folly. By juxtaposing two different wise sayings that say the opposite, what the author is communicating to us is sometimes it's wise to answer a fool in kind, and sometimes it's wise to answer a fool not in kind. And you have to use discernment to figure out which situation you're in. So the natural understanding, to my mind, of don't try to get rich in Proverbs is that should not be your highest priority. Among other reasons, because if that is your highest priority, then you're putting riches above God and pleasing God, and that's going to lead you to do immoral things. And that's what Jesus is talking about when he says it's harder for a rich man to enter heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. He means because in that day, they did not have a developed economy. They didn't have economic opportunity. And in order to become rich, people frequently had to do immoral things. They had to exploit other people. They had to break rules. That was the only way most people could acquire wealth at the time. It was very hard to get out of a hand-to-mouth poverty situation if you weren't doing immoral things. And so that's why Jesus says it's harder for people who are wealthy to enter heaven in that cultural circumstance. Fortunately, today we have, at least in the developed world, we have a developed economy where there is economic opportunity and people can grow material resources without having to do immoral things. And so the same thing doesn't apply today in the same way.
Andrew, I'm going to leave that one there because there are still lots of folks that have questions. So Miguel here in California, listening on Catholic.com. You are up next, Miguel. Go ahead with your question.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Yeah. By the way, folks,
Okay,
you don't need to ask if we can hear you. We'll tell you if we can't.
Okay.
What can we do for you,
Sorry.
Miguel?
But my question was if competition was a sin. Recently, I heard a couple of Protestant pastors say that it was a sin due to like the sins of the flesh in Galatians. It talks about like envision or sort of things like that. And I was just wondering if
Okay. All right. Is competition a sin?
Well, I can understand how in some circumstances it might be sinful. You know, like if you've got someone who's super boastful and proud of their athletic ability and they want to humiliate other people on the court. Well, okay, that would be sinful, but competition itself is not a sin. And I can show that by pointing out a couple things. The first one, competition is built into us. And it's built into us from the time that we are very young. In fact, you can see this in other organisms like cats and dogs. When they're puppies and kittens, they play fight. They compete with each other. They're programmed to do that. In the same way, human children are programmed by God to play fight, to compete with each other, whether it's, battling with lightsabers or playing sports or whatever it may be. That's competition. Now, why is competitive play built into kittens and puppies and human children? It's because that competitive play simulates dangerous situations that we will be in later in life. So puppies and kittens are going to get into fights as adult cats and dogs. They need to know how to handle themselves for that. And so the play that they engage in as infant organisms is preparing them for life as adults. And the same thing happens with us. That's why we play. That's why we enjoy drama and seeing competition between characters in a story, because it helps us emotionally and intellectually process experiences that we may one day find ourselves in. So this also play, because it's fun, it smooths social interactions. You learn respect for the other team. You enjoy playing with other people, no matter who wins or loses. If you're being a good sport, it can help build social interactions. So competition itself is not a sin, Also, competition in the marketplace results in better service for the customers. If you have different businesses competing for business, both of them are going to provide better service than if they had no competition. So that helps society grow. It helps society flourish. And so competition actually has a lot of benefits. And consequently, it is not a sin in and of itself. It can become sinful when carried to excess, just like anything can become sinful when carried to excess. But fundamentally, competition itself is not sinful. It actually has positive roles to play.
And thank you, Miguel, very much for the question. Those who we didn't get to, well, we're going to do this 3 more times. 6 if you could do it by hour this week. So I hope we'll get to talk with you later in the week. Jimmy Akin, thank you very much for 2 hours, 2 big hours today. Thanks for helping us on a Tuesday.
My pleasure.
Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World drops on Fridays. In Search of Jesus' Tomb this week. That does it for us. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.